I took my daughter and her husband in after he gambled their house away. 8 months later, at my own table, he said, "You don't need all this space. You'd be happier in a nursing home." My only daughter said, "Dad, he's not wrong." They woke up to their things on my lawn. My son-in-law told me over dinner at my own table that I did not need this much house anymore, that a man my age would be happier somewhere with people around him. He said it 4 months after I took his family in a home he was living in rent-free, because he had lost his own. My daughter set her fork down, looked at him, and then looked at me and said, "Dad, he's not wrong. This place is too much for one person." Then she picked her fork back up and kept eating her dinner. My granddaughter, 17 years old, sitting 3 feet away, stopped chewing entirely and did not start again for the rest of that meal. If anyone has ever eaten at your table and then told you where you belong, stay with me for this one. My name is Warren Tolliver. I am 67 years old, and I spent 34 years as a union boilermaker, mostly doing outage work inside coal-fired power plants across 3 states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, climbing into furnaces the size of a barn once the units went cold, welding and inspecting boiler tubes in heat that never fully left the metal even after 3 days of shutdown. I have 2 hearing aids I don't like wearing, and a left hand missing the top joint of its ring finger, which happened in 1988, and is a much less interesting story than people expect it to be. I retired at 63 with a pension from the Union Hall, and a body that reminds me every morning what 34 years of that work actually costs a man. My wife's name was Corinne. She was a town librarian in Harlow's Ford for 24 years, and she died of breast cancer in 2011, when our daughter was 25. I have lived alone in this house since. It sits on 9 acres outside town, and I built most of it myself. Not all of it, and I want to be exact about that, because men my age tend to round up when they tell this story. A contractor put the shell in the roof in 1994, and I paid him a fair price for honest work. Everything after that, I did the wiring, every foot of it, the plumbing, the cabinets and the floors, which took me the better part of 2 winters working nights after outages. The addition off the east side in 2006, when Corinne finally got the sewing room with a good light she'd been asking for since we moved in, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 2,400 square feet, and shop out back, 32 by 36. With a hydraulic lift I bought used from a garage that was closing in Franklin. The mortgage on this place has been paid off since 2015. It is the only thing of real value I own, and it means nothing to anybody in this world except me. And a man sat at my own table and told me it was too much house for one man to keep. My daughter's name is Marissa. She is 40 years old. She was 14 when her mother got sick the first time and 25 when it finally took her. And there is a stretch of years in the middle of that girl's life I would give almost anything back and live differently. I was not there for most of it. I was on outages, 3 weeks in Ohio, 5 weeks in West Virginia, home for 4 days and gone again, and that is not an excuse, and I stopped offering it as one a long time ago. There were medical bills that came to a number I am still not going to say out loud, and I paid every dollar of it by working, and I have had to make my peace with the fact that the way I loved my wife, in the years she needed me most, was mostly by not being in the room. Marissa and I found our way back to each other after Corinne died. We were close, genuinely close, for almost a decade. She married Denny Marsh in 2012. He was 31 at the time, a sales manager at a truck dealership out in Brockway, and I liked him. I want to be honest about that, because it makes what came later harder to explain, not easier. He had an easy charm about him. The sort of man who could hold an entire room at a family gathering without seeming to try, cracking jokes at the grill, while everybody else just stood back and let him run the show. My daughter, worn thin from years of watching her mother fade, lit up around him in a way I hadn't seen out of her in a long time, and that alone was enough to make me root for the 2 of them without asking many more questions than that. They had Piper in 2009, before the wedding, and Dash in 2012. Piper is 17 now. Dash is 13. I bought them a house. Not the house, the down payment. In 2016, Denny and Marissa found a place in Brockway, 3 bedrooms on a half acre, and they were $24,000 short of what the bank wanted to see. I gave them the money. Gave, not lent. There was no note, no paperwork, no conversation about it beyond me writing a check at the same kitchen table, while Marissa cried and Denny shook my hand and told me he'd never forget it. That was money Corinne and I had set aside since 1999 for a fifth-wheel camper we never bought. There's a photograph on my wall of the four of them on the front step of that house the day they closed. Piper is 7 in it. Dash is 4. Marissa is 31 and looks enough like her mother in that picture that it stops me sometimes if I'm not ready for it. Denny has his arm around her, and he's holding up a key. That photograph was on my wall the entire 8 months his family lived under my roof. It's still there. Piper asked me about it back in spring, and I told her I was going to leave it up, and she said good, and neither of us explained what we meant by that. He gambled that house away over 11 years. Everybody pictures a man losing a house at a card table in one bad night, and that is almost never how it actually happens. Denny Marsh went to a casino maybe twice a year his whole life. What he had was a phone. Pennsylvania legalized sports betting in 2018, and by 2019, there was an app on his phone with his thumbprint on it, and he could put $300 on a college basketball game between two schools he couldn't have found on a map at midnight, lying next to his sleeping wife. Here is what he did to that house, as best as anybody's been able to piece together since. In 2019, they took out a home equity line of credit for $38,000. Marissa signed that one and knew about it. She thought it was for a used truck and some dental work, and about $11,000 of it actually was. In 2021, he refinanced the mortgage, which reset a loan that was 9 years into a 30 and pulled out another $52,000. She signed that one too, and she has told me since that she didn't fully understand the paperwork, and I believe her. And I also think there's a difference between not understanding something and not asking a single question about it. In late 2023, he opened a second line of credit with a different lender entirely. Her name is on that one. She never signed it. That's the one that eventually became a criminal matter, and I'll come back to it. By the spring of last year, that house carried close to $310,000 in debt against a property worth maybe $210,000. There's a specific detail from that stretch I didn't learn until the criminal case, and it's the one that tells you the whole shape of the man. In July, 5 weeks before the mortgage payment stopped altogether, Denny took his family to Ocean City for a week. Marissa had asked for it. They hadn't been anywhere in 3 years, and the kids were getting old enough that the window for a trip like that was closing. He put on a card. $3,800. He knew, by then, exactly what was coming. He sat on a beach with his wife and his children for 7 days, knowing it, and let her have that week anyway. Because telling her no would have meant telling her why. They stopped paying in August. The notice came in November. My daughter found out 3 days before Thanksgiving that she was losing her house. 11 years of marriage, from a piece of certified mail sitting on her own kitchen counter. She called me a little after 11 that night and couldn't finish a sentence. I drove the 35 minutes to Brockway and sat with her at her kitchen table until almost 4 in the morning. What I said out loud that night was, "We'll figure out." What I actually felt, and I'm not proud of this, was relief, because for 2 years I had watched my daughter go quiet and thin, and I had built an entire story in my own head about another woman. When she told me it was only money, my shoulders came down. Money I can fix, I thought. I've got a paid-off house and a pension, and nothing to spend it on. I did not understand yet that a man who does this to one house does not become a different man the moment he's standing in yours. The foreclosure went through in January. People asked if I offered paid off myself, so I'll say it plainly. I did. I sat at that kitchen table with a pencil in the back of an envelope and ran the numbers 3 separate times, and it never worked, not even close. $310,000 against a house worth $210,000. There is no boilermaker's pension in the country that reaches across that gap. And if I had put my own paid-off house up trying, I'd have lost both of them inside a year. Denny was in the room while I did that arithmetic. He didn't say a word the whole time. He sat at the end of the table, looking at his phone. I asked him one question. I said, "Is there anything else out there I don't know about?" He looked me dead in the eye and said, "No, sir." He had already opened that second line of credit 4 months earlier. I want to go back, for a moment, to the actual day I told Marissa they'd live with me, because I made it sound simpler than it actually felt at the time. She'd been sitting at my kitchen table for the better part 2 hours with her phone out, pulling up one apartment listing after another in Brockway, doing math out loud that never once came out even. First month, last month, security deposit, a second security deposit on top of that, because her credit was already showing the early signs of what was coming. Denny sat across from her saying almost nothing, which in hindsight was its own kind of tell, since silence was never his natural register. I watched my daughter's shoulders get smaller with every listing she closed out of, and somewhere around the fourth or fifth one, I heard myself say it before I'd fully decided to. "You live here." Marissa looked up like she hadn't quite understood the words. I said it again. 4 bedrooms, 1 old man. It's settled. She started crying at that kitchen table the same way she had the day Denny shook my hand over the down payment 9 years earlier, and I remember thinking, even then, even with no idea what was coming, that there was something almost too neat about history repeating a gesture like that in the very same room. They moved into my house on the 9th of February. That part was my idea. Nobody asked me for it. Marissa was pulling up apartment listings in Brockway on her phone at my kitchen table, and the numbers weren't working, and Piper was starting her junior year of high school in the fall, and I said, "You'll live here." I have 4 bedrooms, and I'm one man, and I hadn't used the upstairs for anything but boxes in almost 8 years. The first 2 weeks were good, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of the story. Having people in that house again was good. Dash took to that shop like I'd built it just for him. That boy had never held a real wrench in his life, and by the second week, he was out there with me on a Saturday morning helping me chase down a starter problem on the truck I've been fixing up since 2020. Piper did her homework at the kitchen table, where her mother used to do hers. Marissa cooked the first several nights, her own mother's recipes, and I sat at that table with my daughter and my grandchildren and thought, well, this is a hard way to get something I wanted for 8 years. That lasted about 3 weeks. I've gone looking since, for the exact day it turned, and there isn't one single day. The closest I can point to is a Sunday afternoon in early March when Denny wandered out to the shop with a beer and asked me, not unpleasantly, what I figured the 9 acres was worth. I told him I had no idea, which was true. I hadn't had the land appraised since 2011. He said I ought to find out. Then he said something about how it was a shame to have that kind of road frontage doing nothing, finished his beer, and went back inside. That's the earliest thing I can point to, and it's nothing at all, and it happened almost 2 months after he'd already done what he'd already done, which I did not know yet. The first real thing was the chair. I have a recliner in the sunroom, brown leather, that the crew gave me when I retired in 2020. They'd all signed inside of the box it came in, and I still have the lid out in the shop. I came in from outside on a Thursday afternoon in late February and found Denny asleep in it with his boots still on. That's nothing, to be fair to the man. People fall asleep in chairs. I mentioned it to Marissa quietly in the kitchen the next morning, asked if she'd tell him to take his boots off first, and my daughter said, "Dad, it's a chair." Then there was the radio. Corinne kept a little transistor radio on the windowsill above the kitchen sink for as long as I can remember, tuned to the gospel station out of Clarion, and she'd have it going every single morning while she made coffee, and after she died, I never once touched that dial, because it felt like the last conversation I still had a way to overhear. In March, I came into the kitchen, and the windowsill was bare. I found a radio 2 days later in a box by the back door, headed for a donation run Marissa was making to the church thrift store. Denny had cleared the windowsill to put a charging dock there for the kids' phones, and nobody had asked me, and nobody had thought to ask what that radio was. I took it out of the box. I didn't say anything to anybody for 4 days. When I finally did say something, I said to Marissa, and I told her that radio had been her mother's, and my daughter said, "Dad, it still works fine. I wasn't going to throw it away. It was just in a box." The third thing was the shop itself. I came back from a hardware store on a Saturday in April and found my whole roll cabinet move 11 feet from where it sat since 1997, and the pegboard I'd hung my hand tools on since we built that shop taken clean down, and every socket dumped into a plastic bin. Denny said he'd been organizing while I was out trying to help. I have run that shop for 27 years. I can find a 9/16 socket in the dark with my eyes shut, and it took me most of a weekend to get it back to where I could work in it without hunting. By May, there were rules in my own house that I hadn't made. The television went off at 9 because Denny had picked up an early shift at the dealership doing inventory 2 mornings a week. That's a reasonable enough thing to ask for, except I've gotten up at 5:30 every day of my adult life. And by the middle of May, I was making my morning coffee in the dark because he'd mentioned the kitchen light coming on too early. He had people over on a Friday night in May without telling me first. 5 or 6 men from the dealership around a fire pit in my own backyard until well past midnight. Bottles left in the grass, I picked up myself the next morning before anybody else was awake because I wasn't going to be the man who complained about it. In June, my grandson Dash came out to the shop and told me something had gone missing off the shelf. A small tin box, the kind that used to hold hard candy, that had sat on a shelf by my workbench my entire adult life. Inside, it was my father's Korean War service medal and his dog tags. My father drove coal trucks out of mine in Elk County most of his life and was dead of a heart attack at 59. And that tin box was one of maybe 3 things of his I still have. Dash said some of the men from that Friday night fire pit had come out to the shop to look at the lift, and after that, he'd noticed the tin was gone. I looked for 2 weeks. I went through that shop 3 separate times, every drawer in a roll cabinet, every plastic bin Denny had dumped my sockets into, on my knees on the concrete floor, with a flashlight looking under the workbench like a much younger man. I have never accused anyone of anything, and I never will, because I don't know, and a man who accuses without knowing is a man I don't want to be. But I want to tell you honestly what that 2 weeks does to a person. It isn't really about the tin box. It's that a 67-year-old man ends up on his knees with a flashlight, searching his own building, while the people who put him there are inside eating dinner he half paid for. There's a habit I picked up from 34 years of outage work that I want to explain before I tell you about the dinner, because it matters for what I did afterward. When something goes wrong on a job, a leak you can't see the source of, a reading that doesn't match what it should, you don't react first. You inventory. Where's the pressure coming from? What's still live? Who's standing where? I have used that habit exactly twice in my personal life, and the second time was at my own kitchen table on a Sunday in September. All 5 of us were there. Marissa had cooked, which by then was rare enough that I remembered specifically, pot roast, her mother's recipe, done right. Denny had 2 beers in him, which for him was nothing at all, and about halfway through the meal, he started in on the property again, the way he'd been doing on and off for a month by then. What the acreage would go for if it were split into lots, whether the county would allow a second driveway cut, whether I'd ever thought about what I'd do if the stairs ever got to be too much for me. And that night at that table, he said, "You know what you ought to do, Warren?" I said, "What's that?" He said, "You ought to look at one of those places over by the hospital in Du Bois. My aunt's in one like it in Clarion. They got the whole thing set up, meals, activities, people your own age around you." I said, "I'm 67 years old." He said, "Yeah, but it's just you rattling around in a house this size." Then he said the rest of it. He said, "You don't really need all this space anyway. You'd probably be a lot happier around people your own age." I've been asked to repeat the exact wording more than once, and I think it matters, so I'll give it to you straight. He didn't say it angry, and he wasn't drunk, and he wasn't being cruel in the particular way people are cruel when they're trying to be. He said it the way you'd mentioned to somebody that their tire looked low, like it was already a settled question in his own head, and he was simply doing me the courtesy of walking me through out loud. I looked at my daughter. She had a fork in her hand. Marissa set it down and said, "Dad, he's not wrong. This place is too much for one person." Then she picked the fork back up and kept eating. Piper, 17 years old, at the end of that table, stopped moving entirely. She looked at her mother, and then she looked at me, and I have thought about that look for a year now, and I still haven't gotten all the way to the bottom of it. Dash kept eating. He was 13, and he didn't track what had just happened, and I'm glad he didn't. He asked me about it months later, in the summer, out of nowhere, asked if his dad had said something once about an old folks' home, and I said yes, and he asked why, and I told him Piper had mentioned it to him, and that it happened a while back, and that people say things. He thought about that for a second, and then asked whether I wanted help pulling the fuel pump on the truck. He's 13. He's going to get the rest of this eventually. probably at 20 or 25, and there's not a thing I can do about that except be alive when it lands on him. I didn't say anything for what felt like a long time, though I'm told it was close to 10 seconds. I didn't get angry, and I thought about why. And the closest I've come is that anger needs a certain amount of surprise behind it, and by September there wasn't much surprise left in me. What I did instead was run the inventory. 2 grandchildren at the table, one of them watching me closely, a daughter with no house, no job and going on 9 years, and no money of her own. A man across the table who had clearly said this exact sentence to my daughter in private before he ever said it in front of 4 other people. Because nobody floats an idea like that cold in company. An old man with a paid-off house and a dead wife and nobody in the world he was going to call if things went sideways. That's what was in the room. Then I said, "Is there any more of that gravy?" And Marissa passed it down the table. Nobody raised a voice that night. Nobody left the table. I had a second helping of pot roast in a house I built with my own 2 hands while my daughter and her husband talked about something on the television, and my granddaughter didn't eat another bite. I did the dishes afterward, same as I always do, and I stood at that sink a long time after everybody had gone up, with the water running over my hands, looking out at a dark yard, 67 years old, 34 years climbing into furnaces that could have killed me a dozen different ways. 2 grandchildren under my roof who are my own blood, and a man I'd taken out of the cold had just told me where I ought to be living, and my own daughter had agreed with him, and I had asked for the gravy. That's the moment. Not the chair, not the radio, not the tin box. That's the one that actually did it. I didn't sleep that night. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, I made a decision, and the decision wasn't to put anybody out of my house. The decision was that I was going to find out exactly how far along whatever this was had already gotten, because a man doesn't say a sentence like that at a dinner table unless he's already been carrying around in his head a good while. And in my experience, by the time somebody tells you what they think you ought to do, they've usually already started doing it. I went to the county recorder of deeds office on a Tuesday in the first week of October. I didn't go there doing detective work, and the reason matters. I'd finally gotten around to something Corinne used to nag me about for years, updating my will and setting up a small trust for grandkids' education, and the attorney's office had told me over the phone to bring a copy of my deed to the first meeting. I couldn't find mine. It had been in a drawer in the study for 30 years, and I hadn't looked at it since God knows when. It's a public office. Anybody can walk in. There's a counter and a woman behind it. Her name is Donna, and I sent her a fruit basket in December, which she told me was unnecessary, and you give her the parcel number, and she pulls it up on the screen, and it costs $2 a page. I gave her my address. She typed for a second, and then she said, "Okay, which one did you want?" I said, "What do you mean, which one?" She turned the monitor about a foot toward me and said, "There's 2 instruments recorded against this parcel. There was my deed from 1994, and there was a general warranty deed, recorded on the 4th of February of this year, conveying an undivided 1/2 interest in that property from Warren J., Tolliver to Dennis R., Marsh and Marissa T. Marsh, husband and wife. Signed, notarized, recorded and stamped by that county. My own signature was on it. I stood at that counter for a while, without saying anything. Donna asked if I needed to sit down. I said, "Can I get a copy of that?" $2 a page, 5 pages, $10. I sat in my truck in the lot behind that building for the better part of 40 minutes with $10 of paper on the passenger seat, and I didn't feel much of anything, which is the honest report, and I've given that report to 4 different people since, and not one of them has believed me. I've stood next to a boiler that let go during a pressure test before more than once in 34 years, and there's a specific thing that happens in a moment like that where the event is already over before your body has an opinion about it. And you're standing there afterward with your hands shaking and your head completely clear, thinking through the next step, because the shaking and the thinking aren't connected to each other at all. That's what those 40 minutes in that parking lot were. I read those 5 pages a dozen times. I read the legal description of my own 9 acres. I read my own name spelled correctly. The 4th of February. I'd had a knee replacement on the 22nd of January, outpatient, home the same evening. Nothing dramatic, and I remembered sitting in that truck that Denny had come into the sunroom during that stretch with a folder under his arm. He'd said it was insurance paperwork, some mix-up between the surgical center and the carrier, forms that needed to go back signed, or they'd bill me the difference direct. I remembered the folder. I remembered him standing over me holding the top of the pages steady while I signed, my knee wrapped and elevated, my head thick with the oxycodone they'd sent me home with. I remembered saying thank you. There was a notary stamp on that deed. His name is Todd Vance, and he's a friend of Denny's from the dealership in Brockway, and he's a commissioned notary in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He was never in my house. I have never in my life been in a room with that man. That's a false notarization, and it's a felony. I didn't go home. I drove straight to the appointment I already had. Because I had it, I sat down across from a woman named Naomi Fitch, who I'd never met before that afternoon, and who was expecting a routine 40-minute conversation about a simple will. I put 5 pages down on her desk and said, "I need you to tell me if this is what I think it is." She read it twice. Then she asked me one question, and it's the question that decided everything that came after, and I've thought a great deal about how close I came to answering it wrong. She said, "Mr. Tolliver, did you sign this?" I said, "That's my signature." She said, "That's not what I asked you. Did you sign this document knowing what it was?" I said no. She said, "Are you certain? Because if you're not certain, we handle this a very different way." I sat there a good 10 seconds and made myself go through it properly, the way you double-check a weld seam before you sign off on a vessel going back into service. Because a man who's wrong about a thing like this can destroy his own family for nothing. I said, "I had a knee operation on the 22nd of January. There's a record of it. I was on oxycodone for close to 2 weeks afterward. My son-in-law handed me a folder and told me it was insurance paperwork, and I didn't read it, and I signed it. And the man whose stamp is on that page has never once set foot inside my house." Naomi Fitch put her pen down and said, "All right, we're not doing a will today. If a document like that could be sitting on your own property right now without your knowledge, I want you watching for what comes next, because what she found over the following 8 days is the part that actually matters most. If this is your first time here, I put one of these up most days. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments how many years it's actually been since you looked at your own deed. I bet it's longer than you think. Here's what she explained to me over the next hour, and I'm laying it out because most people don't know any of it, and anybody over 60 ought to. A deed signed by the actual owner but obtained through deception isn't automatically void. It's voidable, which means someone doesn't go to court and ask, and until that happens, it just sits there on a record looking real. And while it sits there, the person named on it can borrow against it. That's the entire danger. That's the whole reason the thing is built the way it's built. She asked me, "Has anyone applied for a loan against this property?" I told her I had no idea. She said, "We'll find out today." She had a title company run it that same afternoon as a rush order. There was a home equity loan application in underwriting with a lender out of Pittsburgh, submitted in the 3rd week of September for $124,000, secured against my property, in the names of Dennis and Marissa Marsh. It hadn't funded yet. It was sitting in underwriting. He sat at my table 3 weeks after submitting that application and told me I'd be happier around people my own age. My daughter agreed with him and passed me the gravy. Naomi Fitch is about 45 and runs a small real property and estate practice out of a converted house on Grant Street in Clarion, 3 attorneys, and a paralegal. She charges $350 an hour, and she was worth every dollar of it, and I'll come back to that number at the end, because it's the thing I actually want people to take away from all this. She did 4 things over the following 8 days, and the order of them matters more than almost anything else in this whole business. The first thing she did, that same afternoon, before I'd even left her office, sitting in a chair watching her do it, was file an affidavit relating the title along with a notice of lease pendens, which is a Latin term for exactly what it sounds like, a public notice that a piece of property is caught up in a lawsuit. A runner took it to the courthouse before 5 o'clock that day. It killed that loan application within 48 hours. No lender in this country funds against a parcel with a lease pendens sitting on it. The underwriter closed the file. Denny got an email about it on a Friday, and I know that because I was standing in the kitchen when he read it. He said, "What the hell?" I said, "Everything all right?" He said, "Work thing." He had no idea. For the next month, that man walked around my house with absolutely no idea what had already happened. The second thing she filed was an action to quiet title and avoid the deed for fraud. The third thing she told me to do was say nothing. She was very clear about that part. She said, "Mr. Tolliver, you are going to want to have a conversation with your son-in-law, and you are not going to have one, not one word, because the second he knows, he starts explaining, and an early explanation on the record is worth a great deal to a defense attorney." I said, "He's living in my house." She said, "Yes, and he's going to keep living in your house until I tell you otherwise, and you're going to be exactly as pleasant as you were last week." Everybody thinks the hard part of a thing like this is the ending. It isn't. It's the 30-some days in between when you already know and nobody else does. I'll give you 3 of them so you understand what that actually is. The 11th of October, Denny asked me to help him carry a dresser up to Piper's room. 20 minutes. The 2 of us on the stairs, him walking backward, me telling him to watch the corner. At the end of it, he said, "Thanks, Warren." I said, "Anytime." The 24th of October, we had 11 people at the table for an early Thanksgiving gathering his mother's schedule required, including Denny's mother down from Brockway, and I said grace because Marissa asked me to, and Dennis Marsh bowed his head at my table while I thanked God for my family. I had been to the district attorney's office 9 days before that, the 2nd of November. He came out to shop around 8 at night and asked if I'd take a look at his truck, said it was pulling hard to the right. I put it up on the lift and found a bad tie rod end and told him what it had cost him at a shop in town, and then I told him I had the part and I'd do it Saturday. I fixed that man's truck on the 7th of November. The sheriff's office called me on the 9th. I made coffee every one of those mornings. I've made a full pot in the dark every day of my adult life. And for over a month, I made that coffee in a kitchen I could no longer stand to be in, knowing exactly what was sitting in a filing cabinet on Grant Street. I went to Dash's basketball scrimmage on the 14th of October and sat next to Denny Marsh on a bleacher for an hour and talked about the boys' jump shot. That was the hardest hour of the entire year, not the courtroom later. A bleacher, because a man is, in the plain daily way, a decent enough father to that boy. He shows up to the games. He gets up early for work. He is not a monster in the way that word usually gets used. And I have to say that plainly or none of the rest of what I'm telling you is honest. He is a man who did a monstrous thing to the people who took him in, and both of those facts are true at the same time. And I have never managed to fit them together, and I've stopped trying. The 4th thing Naomi did was call the district attorney's office. That wasn't my idea, and I want to be clear about it, because there's a version of this story where I come off as a man who set out from the start to put his daughter's husband in prison, and that isn't what happened. What I wanted at first was only my house back. She told me it wasn't entirely up to me. She said, "When somebody records a false notarization, that's not a private dispute between 2 men anymore. That's a crime against the Commonwealth, and I'm obligated to report it." Then she said the thing that ended whatever hesitation I still had. She said, "Mr. Tolliver, he did this in February. What do you think he does in June if it works?" The DA's office picked it up in the 2nd week of October and assigned it to a woman named Grace Winslow, who handles financial crimes and exploitation of older adults for that county. She interviewed me on a Wednesday for a little over 2 hours, and she was not warm, and she was extremely thorough, and at the end of it she said one thing I've held on to since. Grace Winslow is about 50, has a corner office with nothing personal in it, and took notes by hand the entire time. She asked me the same question 4 different ways over 2 hours, and I understood by the 3rd one that she wasn't confused. She was checking whether my answer moved. At one point, she asked what I'd eaten the morning of the surgery. I told her I honestly couldn't remember, and I understood, watching her write that down, that this was the right answer, because a man who's rehearsed a story remembers his breakfast. Near the end, she said, "Mr. Tolliver, I get a dozen of these a year in this county, and almost none of them go anywhere. Do you know why?" I said no. She said, "Because the victim won't sign a complaint. It's almost always a son or a daughter's husband. They get to my office. They see what it's going to do to the family, and they stop." Then she said, "So before I spend 4 months on this, I need to know which kind you are." I told her I was the other kind. She said, "Everybody says that, sitting right where you're sitting." I said I understood. She said, "No, I mean it. Everybody says it." And about 7 out of 10 of them call me back in 6 weeks and tell me their daughter isn't sleeping. I said, my daughter hasn't slept right since Thanksgiving, and she doesn't know the half of it yet. Grace Winslow set her pen down for the first time in 2 hours and said, all right, let's go. The sheriff's office and a locksmith came to my house at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November. You can't simply put people out of your own house in Pennsylvania, and I didn't try to. Once the lease pendens was recorded and the quiet title action was filed, Naomi also petitioned the court for an emergency order on occupancy on the grounds that the people living there were parties to a pending fraud action concerning that same property, with a documented risk of further encumbrance. The judge granted a temporary order, giving them 72 hours to vacate. That order was served on a Friday. Denny read it in the kitchen, and according to Marissa, he laughed and told her it was posturing, that I'd fold by Sunday the way I always folded. 11 years of Christmases and $24,000 and a shop full of tools and a bedroom for his kids. And the read on me in that house, apparently, was that I always folded. They didn't pack a single box. So at 7:20 that Tuesday, 2 deputies from the county sheriff's office came up my drive with a locksmith behind them, and I stood in my own front room in a flannel shirt with a cup of coffee in my hand. Denny came down the stairs in a T-shirt, looked at the deputies, then looked at me and said, Warren, what is this? I said the only thing I said to that man the entire morning. I said, you've got 2 hours. Then I went out to the shop. I didn't watch it happen. And people always ask if I did, and I didn't, and it's not because I'm a better man than that. It's because my grandchildren were upstairs. Piper is 17 and Dash is 13, and they came down into a front room with 2 deputies standing in it at 7:20 on a school day, and I was not going to be the man who stood there and let those kids watch their grandfather's face while it happened. So I sat on a stool in my shop and looked at a pegboard that had been rearranged months earlier by a man I was now putting in prison. It took closer to 3 hours and 2, and the deputies were decent about it the whole time. Their belongings went out onto the lawn because there was nowhere else for them to go. That isn't cruelty. That's simply what happens. 2 adults and 2 teenagers who've been living somewhere for 9 months own a great deal of things, and all went out the front door and onto the grass in November in western Pennsylvania, and my nearest neighbor is most of a mile down the road and came out to enter her own driveway and stood there watching. Piper came out to the shop first, a little after 9, a coat thrown over her pajamas. She stood in the doorway and didn't come in. I said, you ought to be at school. She said, Grandpa, is this because of what he said at dinner? 17 years old. And that's what she thought this was, that her grandfather had waited 7 weeks and then called the sheriff over a single sentence at a dinner table. I told her the truth, because she's 17 and she'd earned it. I said, no, he put his name on this house back in February. He tried to borrow $124,000 against it in September. I found out about 3 weeks ago. She stood there a while, and then she said, does Mom know? I said, I don't know. And Piper said, she does. She was in the room when he did it. She was wrong about that. Completely wrong. But she's 17 years old, and she had already worked out on her own, before anybody told her a single thing, that her mother was the kind of person who'd be in the room. That's what those 2 grown adults did to that girl. Over 9 months, without either of them ever meaning to. A little after 10:30, Marissa came out to the shop. She'd been crying, and she was furious, and she said, you called the police on us. I said, on him. She said, we have nowhere to go, Dad. Do you understand that? Where are we supposed to go? I said, I don't know. She said, that's it. That's all you've got. I said, Marissa, I've known about the deed for 3 weeks. She stopped moving. She said, what deed? That's the moment I found out my own daughter didn't know. I had been carrying, for 3 weeks, absolute certainty that she did. Her name is on that instrument, Dennis R., Marsh and Marissa T., Marsh, husband and wife. Her name is on the loan application, too, and she had no idea either one existed. I went into the house and got the 5 pages I bought for $10, and I brought them out to the shop, and I handed them to my daughter, and she read them standing up in the cold. Then she sat down on the step and said, in a voice I hadn't heard out of her since she was maybe 15 years old, Dad. I didn't sign this. I said, I know. He didn't need you to. She never signed it. He wrote her name on it. And Todd Vance notarized both signatures, which is exactly why there are 2 counts on the indictment instead of 1. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office got pulled into it in December because a false notarization touches a notary's own commission, which is a Commonwealth matter separate from the county's case. Todd Vance surrendered his notary commission in January and pleaded to a lesser felony and got probation, a fine, and he's 52 years old. And he did that for a friend for the sales floor over what I later learned was an $1,100 debt Denny owed him from a fantasy football pool. Its own small, ugly detail I didn't expect to learn and now can't quite forget. There's a piece of this I haven't told you yet, because Grace Winslow asked me to sit on it until the case resolved, and it resolved in the spring, so I can tell you now. Denny didn't come up with the scheme on his own. He owed money, real money, close to $9,000 by that fall, to a man named Ray Kovac, who ran an informal book on college and pro games out back of a bar in Brockway, and who also, it turned out, did a different kind of business on the side. When Denny couldn't pay, Ray didn't break his legs. He did something a good deal more modern. He introduced him to Todd Vance and explained, in terms Denny later described to investigators, almost word for word, how a man in a tight spot could turn a father-in-law's paid-off house into cash without anybody ever having to know, as long as he moved fast and didn't get greedy. Grace Winslow's office is looking, as of this telling, into whether Ray Kovac has run that same play with at least one other family in a neighboring county. I don't know how that turns out. I may never know, but I want people to understand what happened to me wasn't only a son-in-law with a phone and bad judgment. There was a small, practical machine sitting behind him, built for exactly this. And my family was not the only few it was designed to run on. Denny was indicted in January on 8 counts: forgery, tampering with records, theft by deception, and financial exploitation of an older adult, which in Pennsylvania is its own enhanced offense once a victim is 60 or older, and which turned this from an ordinary fraud case into something the Commonwealth takes considerably more seriously. He pleaded in June. The courtroom on sentencing day was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, maybe 30 seats, half of them empty. Denny's mother sat 2 rows behind him, alone, and didn't look at me once the entire time. Marissa sat beside me, which surprised me a little, and gripped the edge of the bench with both hands through most of it, though she never made a sound. The judge, a woman about my own age with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, went through the counts one at a time in a flat, unhurried voice, and Denny answered, "Yes, Your Honor," to each of them without any inflection I could detect. When she read the financial exploitation count out loud, the one tied specifically to my age, I watched something move across his face for just a second. The first real reaction I'd seen out of him the whole hearing, though I couldn't tell you even now whether it was shame or simply surprise at hearing it stated so plainly in a room full of strangers. I went to that sentencing. Dash didn't, because he was 13. I'd written a statement, 2 pages, worked on it for the better part of 3 weeks, read out loud in my own kitchen more times than I'll admit. When the judge asked whether the victim wished to speak, I stood up and said, "No, Your Honor." I don't fully know why, even now. Naomi asked me about it afterward, and I didn't have a good answer for her. The closest I've come is that everything in that courtroom was already true, already written down, already stamped by the Commonwealth. There was an indictment and a plea and a man sitting in a chair who had already agreed to all of it. And the only thing my 2 pages could have added was the sound of my own voice. And I spent 34 years around equipment that does what it does whether or not you have feelings about it. He got 3 to 7 years and was ordered to pay restitution of $24,000, which the court tied to the original down payment gift on a theory Naomi explained to me once, and I didn't fully follow and didn't argue with. He'll serve most of the low end of that, from what I understand. Pennsylvania isn't especially generous about early release on that class of offense. There was a hearing back in April, before the plea, where I had to sit about 10 feet from him. It was a motion about the folder. His attorney argued that a man who signs documents, and that my memory of what I was told there was exactly that, a memory coming from a 67-year-old man on oxycodone. That's a real argument. It's the argument, honestly. And if Todd Vance had actually been in my house that afternoon, it might have worked. But he wasn't in my house. And a notary swears under commission that he personally witnessed a signature, and Todd Vance swore that in writing with a stamp on it, and there is no version of events that survives that fact once it's on the record. Now I have to tell you about my daughter. And this is the part one have the least peace with. Marissa had nothing. It's one thing to say that. It's another to actually see what it meant in real terms. She was 40 years old. She hadn't worked outside the home since 2015 because she and Denny had decided together, when Dash was born, that it made more sense for her to be home with the kids. 9 years out of the workforce isn't a gap on a resume. It's a wall. She had no house, no car in her own name. The truck was Denny's, financed through the dealership, repossessed within weeks. Her credit wasn't damaged, it was gone, because her name sat on foreclosed mortgage, a home equity line in default, and a deed tangled up in an active fraud case. And there isn't a landlord in that county who runs a background check and rents to a woman carrying all three of those at once. She had $1,100 to her name the week of the eviction. I gave her $3,000 in December. Nobody knows that. Not Piper, not Dash, and I've never brought it up to Marissa since the day I did it. I put it in an envelope and left it on the seat of her car in my own driveway on a Sunday morning, and neither of us has ever said one word about it out loud. People are going to have an opinion about that. Giving money to a woman who sat at my table and agreed I ought to be in a home, and I'm not going to argue with a single one of them. She's my daughter. She agreed with a man who was trying to take my house. And I put $3,000 on the seat of her car 5 weeks later. And I would do it again. And I have never fully worked out what that says about me. Denny's mother took her in for a stretch in Brockway, 5 or 6 weeks. And then that ended. And I don't know the particulars, and I've never asked. Marissa applied to something like 38 jobs between the middle of November and the end of January. I know the number because Piper knows it. And Piper knows it because her mother told her, which is a thing I have some feelings about that I've kept mostly to myself. 9 years out of the workforce with foreclosure and a fraud case sitting on her credit report. She wasn't getting hired anywhere with a desk. She landed something in February at a distribution center outside Clarion, second shift, 2 in the afternoon until 10:30 at night. I want to tell you about one specific rejection Marissa got that January, before that job came through, because Piper told me about it months later, and it's stuck with me since. A regional accounting firm in Clarion had a front desk opening, nothing complicated, and Marissa made it to a second interview before the office manager called to say they decided to go another direction, and when Marissa asked, carefully, whether the credit report had been a factor, the woman on the phone got quiet for a second and then said, not unkindly, "It's not usually something we can look past, especially with the foreclosure and the open litigation both showing." Marissa didn't cry in front of Piper. She told her about it 3 days later. Flat and factual, the way you'd report a delayed flight. Piper told me she almost said something to me about it right then, wanting me to somehow fix it, and then she thought better of it, because, in Piper's words, there wasn't actually anything to fix. That's just what the year cost her. I think that's about the most clear-eyed thing any 17-year-old has ever said to me. She's kept that distribution center job since. Got a raise in the summer. Second shift means you can't raise children. Nobody thinks about that part. You can't have a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old in a rented room somewhere while you're at work from 2 in the afternoon until nearly 11 at night. You can't get them to school in the morning after getting home that late. You can't be at a basketball game. The kids stayed with me from that Tuesday in November, and they never really left. It wasn't a plan. There was no arrangement worked out ahead of time. There was a Tuesday, and their things went out on the lawn. And by that evening, they were back inside the house with their grandfather, and that was simply that. In February, Marissa asked me to meet her at a diner in Clarion. She brought a folder with her. My daughter had a folder, which is a detail I noticed and which undid something in me before she said a single word. It was guardianship paperwork. She'd gone to the county courthouse herself and gotten the forms and filled out her half of them already. She said, "I want you to have them." I said, "Marissa?" She said, "Dad, don't make me do the whole speech." Then she laid it all out anyway, point by point, because backing down halfway has never once been in that girl's nature. She said, "I work until 10:30 at night. I live in a room over a garage. Piper's a senior. She's got college applications due. She needs a kitchen table and somebody awake when she gets home. And I am not," she said, going to be a mother who drags her kids somewhere worse because she can't stand what it looks like to let them stay somewhere better. She signed those papers at a diner table with a pen the waitress lent her. We went to family court in March, and it took about 15 minutes, and the judge asked Piper one question, because Pennsylvania courts will hear directly from a child at age in a matter like this. He asked whether she understood what was happening and whether she agreed with it. My granddaughter, 17 years old, stood up in that courtroom with her mother sitting right there and said, "Yes, sir, I want to live with my grandfather." Marissa didn't cry in that room. She did it in the parking garage afterward, and I know that because I found her there. I want to tell you a little more about that day, because 15 minutes doesn't sound like much until you're the one sitting in the gallery watching your granddaughter answer a judge's question about which parent you want to live with, in a room with her own mother 8 feet away. Piper wore a blazer she'd bought herself with money from a part-time job at the pharmacy, because she said she wanted to look like somebody the judge would take seriously, and when he asked his question, she didn't hesitate for even a second, the way I half expected she might out of some instinct to protect her mother's feelings in the room. The judge asked her one follow-up, whether anybody had told her what to say, and Piper said, "No, sir. I wanted this since November. I just didn't know you could actually ask a judge for it until my mom told me." Marissa's hand found mine on the bench at that point, and I let her hold it, and neither of us said anything about that either, then or since. The fraudulent deed was voided by the court in May. There's an order in the County Court of Common Pleas stating that the general warranty deed recorded on the 4th of February is void ab initio, meaning it's treated as though it never legally existed at all, and the record was corrected. And my house has been entirely mine, the way it's been since 1994, ever since. Dash doesn't know everything yet. He knows his father is in prison for some paperwork trouble with Grandpa's house, which is how Marissa first explained it to him, gently, and which isn't false so much as it's radically incomplete. I've made a decision, one I haven't discussed with Marissa in so many words, that I'm not going to be the one who fills in the rest of that picture for him. That's going to be his mother's job, or his own, when he's old enough to go looking, the same way Piper went looking and found her own answers without anybody's help. I think Dash suspects there's more to it than he's been told. 14-year-olds generally do, but he hasn't asked, and I'm not going to hand him something he hasn't asked for yet. It cost $16,800 in legal fees to prove I own a house I built with my own hands. Naomi Fitch sent me the final invoice in June, and I paid it the day it arrived without a single complaint. And I want to say a word about that, because I think it's the most useful thing I can leave anybody listening to this. People love to say that lawyers get rich off other people's misery, and I understand where that comes from, and I'm not going to offend the profession as a whole. But I would have paid double what she charged me, and it still would have been the best money I've spent my entire life, because the alternative wasn't some smaller, cheaper version of getting my house back. The alternative was not getting it back at all. Naomi still handles anything legal that comes up around this property, and calls periodically just to check in, which I understand isn't standard practice for most attorneys, and which I've come to appreciate more than I let on. Grace Winslow sent a short note after the sentencing, for lines, thanking me for seeing it through, and mentioning that cases like mine make the ones that come after a little easier to bring, because a judge who's seen one clean, documented case is more inclined to trust the next one. I keep that note in the same drawer as my father's discharge papers, which is not a comparison I take lightly, and not one I make to just anybody. Then I sat down and did an arithmetic I did not enjoy doing. $16,800 in fees. $24,000 back in 2016 for a down payment on a house that no longer exists. $3,000 in an envelope on a car seat in December. $43,800 out of a boilermaker's pension and 30-some years of careful saving. Spent over 11 years on a man and a marriage that ended with sheriff's deputy in my front room, and $124,000 that never went out the door only because a woman on the telephone happened to tell me to bring my deed to an appointment about something else entirely. I'm not going to tell you that number bitterly, because I had it, and having it is the entire reason this went the way it went instead of the other way. If I had been 67 years old with a pension and nothing saved beside it, that deed is still sitting on the record today. That loan funds in October. There's a lien against my house for $124,000 that I find out about the day a default notice shows up in my mailbox. And by then it's a man with a $350 an hour lawyer on his side of the table, and nothing at all on mine. Anybody listening to this who is over 60 needs to hear that part clearly. I did not win because I was clever. I won because I could afford $17,000, and because I happened to need a copy of my own deed for something unrelated on a Tuesday in October. That's the entire margin this whole thing turned on. That's all of it. There were 4 days between the eviction and the kids coming back that I haven't told you about yet. The first night, that Tuesday, after the sheriff's car and a locksmith's van had both pulled out of the drive and the last of somebody else's furniture had come off my lawn, I sat alone in that house for the first time since February. I made myself dinner, 1 plate, at a table built for 6, and ate it in near silence, except for the tick of the clock over the stove that Corinne bought at a church rummage sale sometime in the 90s. The house felt enormous in a way it hadn't felt in 9 months, and enormous in a way I hadn't felt it feel since the year right after Corinne died, when I first understood what a house built for a family actually sounds like once the family's gone from it. I walked through every room that night, which I hadn't done in longer than I could say. Piper's old room, now stripped down to a bed frame and a water stain on the ceiling I kept meaning to fix. Dash's room, a single sneaker left behind under the bed that I found 2 days later and kept in a drawer until he came back for it. I stood a long while in the doorway of what had briefly been Marissa's room again, 30-some years after it was hers the first time, and I thought about the word rattling, the specific word Denny Marsh had used at that table, and I thought, standing there in an empty hallway at 11 at night, that maybe he hadn't been entirely wrong about the sound a house makes with only one person left inside it. He'd just been dead wrong about what the answer to that sound was supposed to be. They didn't come straight to me. Marissa took them to Denny's mother's place in Brockway that Tuesday, because that's where she was headed, and they're her children, and I understood that, and I did not call. I want anyone who's been through something like this to understand why. It isn't pride. If I had called and asked for those kids that week, it becomes a thing I took from her, and every argument for the next 20 years carries that inside it. So I cleaned my house for 4 days. That's what I did with myself. I cleaned a house that didn't need cleaning. I put the pegboard back exactly the way it had been since 1997, hung every tool where it belonged. And it took me most of a full day, and I was in absolutely no hurry about any of it. Marissa called on the Friday night, a little after 9. She said, "Can they come back?" I said, "When?" She said, "Tonight." They were in my driveway by 10:30. Dash had his backpack and a duffel bag. Piper had a laundry basket with what looked like her whole life crammed into it. Neither one of them said much of anything, and neither did I, and they went upstairs, and that was that. The kids have been with me 11 months now. Piper's a senior. She got into a state university in the spring for nursing. Found out on a Thursday afternoon, and screamed loud enough in my kitchen that I dropped the pan on the floor. Dash is 14 now, and he's out in that shop every single weekend. And he's taken that truck almost entirely apart, and I let him, because he's going to have to put it back together, and he doesn't know that yet. There's a thing about Dash I didn't expect. He asks about his father regularly, not defiantly, and not to hurt me. He's 14, and he loves his dad. And his dad is in a state correctional facility outside Huntington. And both of those things are simply true at once. I take him once a month on a Saturday. I drive him out, and I sit in the parking lot. And I don't go in myself. It's about an hour each way. And we don't talk about where we're headed on the drive out. We talk about the truck every single time, the whole way there. On the way back, he's quiet for the first 20 minutes or so. And then he comes back into himself and asks me something, and it's always about the truck again. There was one Saturday in August where he got back in after the visit and didn't say a word the whole hour home. I didn't push him. He's 14, and I'm not going to make a boy report on his own father to me. When we pulled into the drive, he said, "Thanks, Grandpa." And that was the whole of it, and he went inside. People are surprised when I tell them that. That's his father. I don't get to remove a man from a 14-year-old boy's life because of what he did to me. If Dash ever wants to stop going, he'll stop, and it'll be his decision, and I won't put a finger anywhere near that scale. Piper hasn't gone once. She was at that table in September. She heard him say it, and she heard her mother agree with it. And she was 17 years old and old enough to understand exactly what she was watching. Something closed in that girl that night, and I don't believe it's going to reopen, and she's never once talked to me about it, and I've never brought it up. There's one more thing about Piper I have to include, because it's the single good thing to come directly out of any of this, and it took me nearly 8 months to even find out about it. In March, she wrote her college application essay. She didn't show it to me. She showed it to a teacher and a guidance counselor, and she never once mentioned it to her own grandfather. I found out about it in October, when that teacher stopped me in the grocery store in Harlow's Ford. She said, "Mr. Tolliver." Then she said, "I read your granddaughter's essay." I said, "Oh." She said, "I've been doing this 20 years. I read maybe 400 of them a year. I've thought about that one every week since March." I said, "What was it about?" And that woman said, "It was about a man who put a pegboard back the way it was." I stood in a grocery store and couldn't say a single word for a moment. Piper had watched me. Sometime during those 4 days in November, when I didn't know where those kids were, she'd gone out to that shop after coming home with a laundry basket at 10:30 at night, and she'd seen every tool hanging where it had been since 1997. She's 17 years old, and she understood exactly what she was looking at. I've never mentioned any of it to her. She doesn't know that teacher ever spoke to me. I'm going to let her tell me about it herself. Someday, if she ever wants to. Marissa comes on Sundays. She works second shift, so Sunday's what she has. She's at my door most weeks around 11 in the morning and stays until 3 or 4. It isn't comfortable, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you it is. She sits in the kitchen of the house she grew up in as something closer to a guest than a daughter. She asks before she takes anything out of my own refrigerator. I've told her twice to stop doing that, and she does it anyway, and I've stopped mentioning it. She and Piper aren't right yet, and I don't think that one resolves quickly, if it resolves at all. A 17-year-old girl sat at a table and watched her mother agree that her grandfather ought to be put somewhere else. Piper is polite to her mother. That's the whole of it right now. And Marissa knows exactly what that politeness cost both of them. She apologized to me twice. The first time was back in December, in my driveway, and it wasn't any good. Mostly about how hard everything had been, how she hadn't known, how she wasn't the one who'd actually done it. I let her get through it, and told her it was all right, and let her go. The second one came in July, and I wasn't expecting it. We were standing in the kitchen, and she was drying a dish, and out of nowhere she said, "I heard him say it." I said, "Say what?" She said, "At the table in September, about the home. I heard him, and I agreed with him." She didn't say anything else for a moment. Then she said, "I've gone over why I did that about 1,000 times, and the honest answer is I couldn't afford to be on your side." Then she said, "Because you were never going to put me out, and he was the one who could." And she said, "I traded you. I knew I was doing it, and I did it anyway, and I did in front of my own children." That's the apology. That's the real one. There hasn't been another, and I don't think there needs to be. I said, "I know." She said, "That's it?" I said, "Marissa, I've known that since the shop, standing on my knees with a flashlight. You did the arithmetic, and I lost." She said, "Does that make it better or worse?" I said, "It makes it understandable. Understandable isn't the same thing as all right. That's about where I am with it. And I don't know if it moves from here." She nodded and finished drying the dish. We haven't talked about it again since, and I don't expect we will. I asked Marissa once, a few months before that conversation, what that first week alone with the truth had actually felt like for her. Finding out, in the same single afternoon, that her marriage was built on something rotten, and that her own signature had been forged on top of it. She thought about it a long moment before answering. "Honestly, Dad, mostly numb. I kept waiting to feel something bigger, and it just didn't come. I think the eviction itself used up whatever I had left to feel that week. By the time I found out he'd forged my name too, I didn't have anything left to spend on being angry about it specifically. I was just angry generally all the time at everything for about a month." She looked at me. "I'm still a little like that, honestly. I don't know when that goes away." I told her I didn't know either, and that I still occasionally woke up at 3 in the morning replaying a recorder's office counter. So if she was looking for a timeline for me, I didn't have a good one to give her. I want to tell you about Denny and Marissa's wedding day, too, because it's worth remembering honestly, and because I think it explains something about how a family lets a man this deep into its life in the first place. It was a small ceremony at a Methodist church in Brockway, October 2012, unseasonably warm, and Denny cried during his vows in a way that surprised everybody who thought they had him figure for nothing but bluster. He'd written his own vows, which Marissa hadn't expected, and one line from them has stuck with me for 12 years. He said he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure Marissa never again had to carry something heavy by herself the way she had those years with her mother. I remember thinking, standing in the second row in a rented suit, that it was as decent a thing as I'd ever heard a young man say out loud in a church. I don't know what happened between that man at the altar in 2012 and the man who sat at my table 12 years later suggesting I move somewhere with people my own age. I've asked myself whether the gambling simply wore down whatever was underneath those vows, or whether what was underneath them was never quite as solid as it sounded on a warm October afternoon, with everybody he loved sitting in folding chairs watching him promise it. I don't have an answer, and I'm not sure one exists that would actually satisfy me if I found it. I took up something this past year I hadn't done since Corinne was alive, which is small enough that I almost didn't include it, and I'm putting it in anyway because I think it matters. She used to keep a vegetable garden along the south side of the house, and I let it go entirely to weeds the year she died and never once touched it again in 14 years. This past April, with the kids settled and the worst of the legal business behind us, I tilled that whole strip of ground back up on a Saturday afternoon, more out of restlessness than any real plan. And Piper came out and helped without my asking her to, and by June we had tomatoes and green beans coming in, the same varieties Corinne always planted, because I still had her seed packets in a drawer in the pantry, unopened, for longer than I want to admit. Piper canned a batch of tomatoes in August using a recipe card in her great-grandmother's handwriting that I've forgotten I still had. I don't know that I believe in signs, exactly, but I know that garden had been dead in the ground for 14 years, and it came back the same year everything else in this house very nearly didn't. I have a friend named Gene Petrosky, worked outages with me for the better part of 20 years, retired 2 years ahead of me, and we get breakfast together most Wednesdays at a diner in town, out of habit more than anything else at this point. Gene noticed something was wrong with me a good 3 weeks before I ever said a word to him about it. He didn't push. That's not how men like us operate. He just started ordering me the same breakfast without asking, and one Wednesday in late October, over eggs, he said, apropos of nothing, "You've got the look of a man carrying a bad reading he hasn't told anybody about yet." I asked him how he figured that. 30 years reading gauges, Warren. I know what a man looks like when the number doesn't match what it's supposed to. He didn't push further than that. He just said, "Whenever you're ready to say something out loud, I'm sitting right here on Wednesday, same as always." I didn't tell him the whole of it for another 2 weeks, right around the time the sheriff's office got involved. And when I finally did, over a cold cup of coffee, Gene didn't say much. He just reached across the table and gripped my forearm once hard, the way men our age do instead of saying the things younger men might say instead, and he said, "You did right, going to a lawyer instead of going out to that dealership yourself." I understood what he meant by that, and he wasn't wrong to say it. There was a version of that fall where I didn't call an attorney, and it does not end anywhere good for anybody involved. I think, if I'm honest, I owe you the parts of this that don't make a satisfying story, because the truest measure this past year isn't only in what Denny Marsh did this spring. Some of it goes back further than that, if I'm willing to look. I met Corinne in 1979 at a Union Hall dance nobody my age even remembers happening anymore, and she was working the coat check because her cousin had roped her into it, and I asked her to dance twice, and she said yes both times, and by the end of the night, I remember thinking here was a woman who wasn't put off by the fact that I already knew exactly what I wanted out of my own life. Steady work, a piece of land, a house I'd build with my own hands someday, because most women my age back then wanted a man with bigger plans than that, and Corinne never once needed me to have bigger plans. I want to be fair to the man I let live in my house, even now, because fairness matters to me, and the truth serves better than a story where he was a villain from the very first handshake. Denny Marsh was, for most of those 11 years, a decent enough father. He never missed a school concert. He drove 4 hours round trip in an ice storm, the Winter Piper, had her appendix out at a hospital in Pittsburgh, and sat in a plastic chair in that hallway till sunrise without one complaint that anybody ever heard. He learned to smoke a brisket the way Corinne used to, badly, every year on her birthday, because he knew it was the one day Marissa couldn't stand being anywhere near a stove herself. Those things happened. I'm not going to pretend they didn't just because of how the rest of this turned out. But there were smaller things. If I go looking for them now, the way you go looking for a splinter you can feel and can't yet see. Back in 2019, not long after that sports betting app first landed on his phone, he asked me once, almost offhand, whether I'd ever thought about putting the land in some kind of arrangement that would make things simpler down the road. I told him I had it already and didn't see the need to complicate it, and he let it drop, and I filed that away as an ordinary son-in-law thinking out loud about family planning, rather than what I now understand actually was the first time that man looked at what I had and started doing arithmetic about it in his head. What I've come to understand, sitting out on that porch some evenings after the kids are up in their rooms, is that 11 years of a decent enough son-in-law builds up exactly the kind of goodwill that makes betrayal easy to miss. Not because people like that inevitably turn on you. Most never do. But because goodwill, once it's old enough, stops feeling like something you're actively extending and starts feeling like simple fact. I don't regret welcoming Denny into this family in 2012. I regret nothing about the 9 of those 11 years the goodwill was actually earned. I only wish, in 2019, and in a handful of smaller moments since that I can't fully list for you now, that I trusted my own instincts exactly as much as I trusted him. I should tell you a little more about my own father, since his metal is the thing that still bothers me most out of everything that went missing that spring, more than money ever could. Cecil Tolliver drove coal trucks out of mine near St. Mary's for the better part of 30 years, and he was a hard man in the ordinary way men of his generation were hard, which is to say he didn't say much and he didn't have to. He served 2 years in Korea before any of that. Came home with Bronze Star he never once talked about, and a hearing problem in his left ear that got worse every year until he died of a heart attack at 59, 3 weeks before I turned 30. That tin candy box with his medal and his dog tags and was one of maybe 3 things of his I still have, and I kept it on that shelf in my shop for going on 40 years. Not because I look at it often, but because I liked knowing exactly where it was. I still don't know what happened to it. Nobody's ever going to be charged with it, because there's no way to prove where it went, and Naomi told me flatly not to raise it in any legal filing, since it would only muddy a case that didn't need muddying. But I want on the record here, in whatever way this counts as a record, that somewhere between a Friday night fire pit in my own backyard and the following Monday morning, my father's service medal disappeared, and it has never come back. I think about it more than I probably should for an object that doesn't run and never did. There was one afternoon during that silent month I came closer than I'd like to admit to giving the whole thing away. Denny came home early from the dealership on a Tuesday and found me at the kitchen table with 3 bank statements spread out in front of me that Naomi's paralegal had helped me pull under my own name. I heard his truck in the driveway before I heard the door, and I had maybe 10 seconds to decide what to do with my face and what to do with the papers. I folded them under a dish towel and had the coffee pot in my hand by the time he walked in. "What you working on?" he said, easy as anything, hanging his jacket on the hook by the door. "Bills," I said. "Insurance company's still sorting out the knee." He laughed at that, the same easy laugh I'd heard 1,000 times across 11 years of holidays, and I stood there smiling back at him with my pulse going harder than it had any business going at my age, thinking the entire time about a deed sitting in a filing cabinet on Grant Street with my forged signature underneath his. I never once told him what I knew, the whole month, not at the dinner table, not in the shop, not on that bleacher at Dash's scrimmage. I have thought since about whether that makes me a patient man or simply a practiced one. 34 years of standing on a platform 40 feet up, keeping my voice level while a piece of equipment underneath me does something it isn't supposed to do. I suspect it's mostly the second thing. There was a clock running underneath all of this that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's the reason I couldn't simply take my time putting the pieces together at whatever pace felt comfortable. Naomi found in the title company's rush report that the loan was scheduled to close on the 11th of November, 5.5 weeks out from the day I first sat down in her office. That date lined up, she suspected, with roughly how long Denny's own story about my supposed confusion after the knee surgery could plausibly hold up if anybody official ever asked, and it gave him just enough runway to have the money moved and spent before anybody thought to double-check anything. 5.5 weeks. That was the actual clock ticking under every dinner, every Wednesday breakfast with Jean. Every Sunday I sat at my own table, making conversation with a man who had $124,000 of my equity already scheduled to hit an account. The lease pendants killed that closing date within 48 hours of my finding out, which meant the entire race, once it actually started, was already over before Denny even knew it had begun. I've thought about that a great deal since. How the most dangerous month of my life ended so quietly, on a piece of paper filed by a runner before 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, while the man at stop was still refinishing a truck's tie rod with me on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, none the wiser. There was one particular evening, about a week into Naomi's digging, that I think of as the night the whole thing actually turned from a discovery into a plan. She came out to my house on a Thursday around 8. After Denny had gone to a dealership sales banquet in Erie, he wouldn't be back from till late, and we spread everything we had across my own kitchen table under the same light fixture Corinne picked out in 1996 that I've never once thought to replace. Bank statements. The 5 pages from a recorder's office. A printout of the loan application Naomi's paralegal had pulled. A legal pad covered in her own handwriting. Dates and dollar amounts marching down the page in a lawyer's careful block print. We worked until well past midnight. Coffee going cold in 2 mismatched mugs. And at some point I realized I refilled her cup 3 times without her asking and hadn't sat down myself once. She finally put her pen down and said, "Mr. Tolliver, you're allowed to just sit at your own table for 5 minutes. You don't have to run this like a shift." I hadn't noticed I was doing it until she said something. I sat down. It was, I think, the first time in that whole ordeal I let somebody else carry something without finding a way to also be useful in the room, and it felt almost as strange as anything else that fall. We finished that night with an actual plan instead of just a pile of facts, which is a different thing entirely. What to file first, what to tell the DA's office, and how long I could reasonably keep a straight face across the dinner table. Somewhere around 1 a.m, packing up her legal pad, Naomi said, "For what it's worth, most men in your position want to handle this quietly inside the family, and I understand the instinct. But some kind of theft need a record and a consequence to actually finish healing from. I think you already know that about yourself." She was right. I did already know it. I just hadn't said it out loud to anyone yet, including myself, until she said it first. I want to tell you what it was like driving home from Naomi's office that first afternoon, because I think it matters more than people expect. I sat in my truck outside my own house for almost 20 minutes before I went in, because I did not yet trust my own face. When I finally did walk through that door, Marissa was at the stove finishing dinner, and Piper was at the kitchen table with a textbook open, and Dash was in the sunroom watching something on his phone with the sound too loud, and Denny wasn't home yet from the dealership. Marissa looked up and said, "How the will thing go?" I said, "Fine. Lot of paperwork." Piper glanced up from her textbook, just a flicker, nothing more, and said, "You look tired, Grandpa." I told her I was, and that was the truest thing I said in that kitchen for the next several weeks. I sat down at that table, across from my own granddaughter doing her algebra homework, and ate a plate of the dinner my daughter had cooked in a house that had a stranger's forged signature attached to half of it, and I said absolutely nothing. And I have thought since about how strange it is that a man can hold something that large inside himself and still pass the potatoes when asked. I thought hard about whether to tell Piper any of it before the day it actually happened. She was 17, old enough to keep a secret if I asked her to, and there were nights that fall I sat on the edge of deciding to bring her into it, just so she wouldn't be blindsided the way she ended up being. I decided against it, in the end, and I still don't know for certain whether that was wisdom or cowardice, and I've stopped trying to resolve which. What decided it, mostly, was picturing that girl sitting across the breakfast table from her own father every morning, carrying a secret that size, and I did not think it was fair to hand a 17-year-old that particular weight just so I could feel less alone carrying mine. I told myself I was protecting her. I have wondered since whether I was really protecting myself from having to watch her carry it. I don't have a clean answer for that, and I'm not going to pretend I do just to make this a tidier story. Grace Winslow told me, near the end of the case, a little more about how these things usually go in her office. And I think it's worth including, because almost nobody outside that kind of work understand the actual numbers involved. She said her unit handles roughly 40 cases a year across the whole judicial district that touch on financial exploitation of people over 60, and that the ones involving a family member, a son, a daughter's husband, a niece with power of attorney, make up the overwhelming majority of them, not the con artists and strangers everybody pictures when they hear the phrase elder fraud. Strangers are easy, she told me. Juries convict strangers without blinking. It's family that people won't sign a complaint on, and family is where almost all of it actually happens. She also told me, on the same afternoon, that the office had opened a separate inquiry into Ray Kovac based partly on what came out of Denny's own statements, and that they'd identified at least one other name, a man in his 70s, 2 counties over, who transferred a half interest in a rental property to a nephew under circumstances Grace described only as familiar, before catching herself and not saying anything further. I don't know what happened with that. I may never know. The way these things often stay sealed, unless somebody like me is willing to stand up in a courtroom and be counted. I think about that man sometimes, whoever he is, and I hope somebody finds his version of a recorder's office counter and a woman named Donna behind it before it's too late for him to do anything about it. People ask me constantly what the warning sign was. What should I have seen? And the honest answer is that there wasn't one single sign. There were a great many small ones, and every single one of them was exactly small enough that a decent man was supposed to let it go. A man falls asleep in your chair with his boots on. You let it go because it's a chair. A man reorganizes your shop. You let it go because he was trying to help. A radio goes in a donation box. You let that go too because it still works fine and it was only sitting in a box, not thrown in the trash. Every one of those, taken by itself, is a perfectly reasonable thing for a decent person to let slide. And that is exactly how it works. Nobody takes a house from a man in one single move. They take a chair and then a shelf, and then the coffee light in the morning, and then a Friday night in the yard. And by September, they're telling you at your own table where you ought to be living. And it doesn't feel like an escalation to anybody sitting in that room, because every single step along the way was small enough for a decent man to let go. The deed was signed in February, 7 months before he ever said a word about it out loud at that table. He wasn't proposing anything that night. He was managing me toward a conclusion that had already been reached months earlier, and dressing it up as a fresh idea he'd only just thought of. So if I have anything at all to leave a man my age who has somebody living under his roof right now, it isn't be suspicious. That's a miserable way to spend whatever years you've got left, and I won't recommend it to anybody. What I'd say instead is this. Go get a copy of your own deed. It costs $2 a page at a public counter. Anybody can walk in. You don't need a reason, and you don't need a lawyer standing next to you, and nobody in your house ever has to know you did it. Once a year, that's all it takes. I built a house with these 2 hands. Every wire and every board of it passed the shell, and I could not have told you in September what the public record actually said about who owned it. A man ate at my table for 9 months, knowing precisely what that record said, while I had no idea at all. I want to be honest that none of this settled as neatly as it might sound, laid out for you in order like this. I don't sleep the way I used to. Some nights I still find myself awake around 3 in the morning, running through that recorder's office counter again in my head, Donna turning the monitor toward me, and I lie there until it passes, which it always eventually does, though it takes longer some nights than others. I've gotten slower to trust people around this place than I used to be. When a contractor came through in the spring bidding on some gutter work, I had Naomi's paralegal run a basic check on the company before I signed anything, which would have struck me as an insult to common sense 2 years ago, and now just feels like ordinary caution. Dash teases me about it sometimes, gently, and I let him, because I would rather be the grandfather who checks than the one who gets fooled twice by the same kind of trouble. But there's also this. On an ordinary Tuesday morning this past spring, I stood in my own shop with Dash. The 2 of us finally putting that truck back together after months of him taking it apart piece by piece, and I felt nothing but the plain, boring contentment of a good morning with my grandson. No knot in my chest, no dread sitting underneath it, just a socket wrench and a boy asking good questions on the radio. Corinne's radio, back on its shelf out there now instead of the kitchen windowsill, because I decided I liked hearing her gospel station out in the shop just as much, playing low in the background. I didn't know, standing there, that I'd remember that particular Tuesday as clearly as I remember the one at the recorder's office counter. But I do, and I expect I always will. Piper told me once, back in the spring, why she picked nursing for her degree, and I think about her answer more than she probably realizes. We were driving back from a college visit, just the two of us, and I asked her, mostly to make conversation, when she'd first landed on it. She said, "I think it was Grandma Corinne, actually, not that I remember her that well. But Mom always talks about how the hospice nurses were the only people who ever told her exactly what was happening straight, without dressing it up." She was quiet a second, watching the road. I think I want to be somebody who tells people the truth, even when it's the hard version. I don't think enough people in my life have done that for me. I didn't say anything for a minute, because I didn't trust my voice yet. Then I told her I thought her grandmother would have been proud of that reason, and Piper said, "I know. I checked with you first before I decided that, actually," which is about as close as that girl comes to sentimental, and it landed harder than almost anything else anybody said to me this whole year. My neighbor down the road, a widow named Sylvia Abbott, who's lived on that stretch even longer than I have, was the one who stood at the end of her own driveway that November morning watching the deputies work. And I want to tell you what she did about a week later, because it stayed with me. She showed up at my door on a Saturday with a casserole dish, the way people did more of years ago, and she didn't ask me a single question about any of it. She just said, "I raised 3 kids and buried a husband on this road, Warren, and I've learned the only thing worth doing for a neighbor in a hard stretch is showing up with food and keeping your mouth shut about why." She's brought something by every few weeks since, and we've never once discussed that morning directly, and I've come to understand that's exactly the kindness she means it to be. Christmas last year was smaller than any I can remember, just the 3 of us, myself, Piper, and Dash. Since Marissa had to work part of that day at the distribution center, second shift covering a holiday differential for extra money she badly needed. She came by afterward, close to 11 at night, still in her work vest, and I'd kept a plate warm for her the way Corinne used to do for me on outage years when I'd missed the actual day and roll in 2 or 3 days late. Piper had made a pie, her first attempt at her great-grandmother's recipe, which was passable and not much more than that, and we all told her it was wonderful anyway, and I think she knew we were being kind about it, and I think she let us be kind about it, which is its own small form of grace between people who've been through a hard year together. I want to say one more thing about the pension that got me through this, because I think it matters for the same reason the legal fees matter. I put 34 years into that union, paid my dues every single month, whether I loved the local's leadership that particular year or not, and never once complained about deductions I couldn't see the benefit of yet. That fund is the only reason I had $17,000 sitting in an account I didn't have to touch a retirement check to reach. A boilermaker 2 counties over, same trade, same risk, without a union card, would have had none of that cushion. And I think about him sometimes, too. Whoever he might be, the same way I think about the man 2 counties over that Ray Kovac may have already gotten to. Marissa got a second raise at the distribution center back in the fall, enough that she's finally started looking at apartment again, on her own terms this time, with an actual credit report that's slowly climbing back towards something respectable. She hasn't found anything yet. I haven't pushed her to. There's no version of my house where I'm in a hurry to see any of them leave, and I think she knows that, even though neither of us has said it directly. Todd Vance came by my house once, back in February, a few weeks after he'd surrendered his notary commission, and before his own plea was finalized. I almost didn't let him pass the porch. He stood there in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and said he wanted me to know he hadn't understood at the time what he was actually helping set in motion. That Denny had told him it was a formality, a family matter Marissa already knew all about and was fine with, and that he'd stamped it as a favor between friends without thinking hard enough about what a stamp like that actually means under the law he'd sworn to uphold when he got his commission in the first place. I told him I believed that he told himself that story. I also told him a notary's whole job, the entire reason the state lets a person carry that seal, is to be the one person in the transaction who doesn't take anybody's word for anything, and that he'd failed at the one thing his commission actually existed to do. He didn't argue with that. He said he was sorry, and I told him I appreciated him saying so, and I did not invite him inside, and he hasn't come back since, and I don't expect he will. I drove out to Corinne's grave on the morning of the sentencing, before the hearing, which isn't something I do often. I'm not a man who finds much comfort standing over a stone, and I think she'd have understood that about me better than anybody. But I wanted to tell her something before I sat in that courtroom, so I did, out loud, in a cemetery outside town with nobody around to hear a 67-year-old man talking to a piece of granite. I told her the kids were safe, and that the house was still ours, and that I was sorry it took me as long as it did to see what was happening under my own roof. I told her I thought she'd have caught it faster than I did. She always did read people better than I could. 31 years of watching her size up a room in about 4 seconds while I was still getting my coat off. Then I told her Piper wanted to be a nurse, and I said I thought she liked that particular detail best of everything else I had to tell her, and I stood there another minute, and then I drove to the courthouse. I heard, through Grace Winslow's office, that Ray Kovac was eventually charged himself, in the early part of this year, on a related count of criminal conspiracy tied to the scheme, based largely on records Todd Vance turned over as part of his own plea agreement. I don't know yet how that resolves. Court dates for that kind of case move at their own pace, slower than anything else in this whole business. And I've made my peace with not knowing the ending of every thread by the time I tell this story. Some of it, I expect, I'll simply never hear the end of, and I've decided that's all right. I think about that phrase more than any other single thing anybody said to me this whole year. People your own age. I've turned it over enough times now that I've come to a conclusion about it I didn't expect to reach. He wasn't wrong that I needed people around me. He was simply wrong, completely and totally wrong, about who those people were going to turn out to be. The ones who actually turn out to matter, as it happens, aren't measured in years at all. There's a woman behind a recorder's office counter who turned a monitor a foot to the left instead of just handing me a printout and sending me on my way. There's an attorney who wouldn't let me sign a single filing until she'd made absolutely certain I wasn't confused about my own memory. There's a retired boilermaker named Jean who ordered me the same breakfast for 3 weeks before I found the words to tell him why I needed it. There's a neighbor with a casserole dish who never once asked me a question I didn't want to answer. And there's a 17-year-old girl who went out to a cold shop in the middle of the worst week of her life and put every tool back exactly where it belonged, because some part of her already understood, before anybody explained a single thing to her, exactly what that shop meant to the man who built it. That's the list. Not one of them is within 20 years of my age, except Jean, and even that's mostly a coincidence of the timing of our careers. Somebody asked me recently, at Jean's diner over eggs, whether I could ever really forget what happened at that table in September. The food he ate that I half paid for, the sentence he said so easily, my own daughter picking her fork back up like nothing at all had happened. I told him I didn't know yet, and that I'd stop pretending I owed anyone a timeline on it. What I do know is this. A man ate my food for 9 months and then told me where I belonged, and I found out in the year that followed exactly who actually belonged around my own table, and it turned out to be almost none of the people I would have guessed a year before he ever said a word. It's been a little over a year now since that dinner in September, and I want to tell you what an ordinary Saturday looks like for me these days, because I think it says more than any tally of legal fees ever could. I wake at 5:30, same as I have my whole adult life, in a house that's entirely mine, the way it's supposed to be. I make coffee with the kitchen light on, because nobody's ever going to ask me to make in the dark again. Dash is usually out in the shop by 8 on a Saturday, and some mornings I let him get a head start on his own before I come out to check his work. Piper leaves for the library most Saturday afternoons to study, and comes home with the particular exhausted satisfaction of a girl who knows exactly where she's headed next fall. Marissa comes on Sundays, same as always, and it still isn't easy, and I've stopped expecting it to become easy, and I've started being all right with that instead. I think about that dinner table more often than I'd like to admit. Denny's voice, easy as anything, telling me I'd be happier around people my own age, and my daughter picking her fork back up like nothing at all had happened. I think about the 2 grandchildren at that table, one of them watching everything, and one of them mercifully too young to track it yet. And I think about the habit that got me through the worst of it, the one I picked up 40 years ago, my first shutdown season, standing inside a boiler in heat that could put a careless man down in a matter of minutes. Don't react first. Inventory the room. Find out exactly what's actually true before you decide what to feel about it. I ran that inventory once at my own kitchen table, and it told me everything I needed to know about who was actually in that room with me. And it was not the two people sitting closest to me that night. It was a woman behind a counter named Donna, and an attorney on Grant Street who asked me one hard question before she'd lift a finger, and a prosecutor who wouldn't touch a case until she was certain I'd actually see it through, and a 17-year-old girl who put every one of my tools back exactly where they belonged before anybody told her to. I did not win because I was owed anything, and I did not win because I was clever. I won because I could afford $17,000, and because a clerk on the phone told me to bring my own deed to an appointment about something else entirely. That's the whole of the margin, and I think about it every single day. The shop is quiet this morning. Dash isn't up yet. The coffee is going, the light's on, and in a little while I expect I'll hear his feet on the stairs. And we'll go out there together and put something back together that somebody else took apart, which is, I have come to understand, most of what the second half of a life like mine actually is. I built that house with my own two hands, and it is still mine. And so is the shop, and so, as it turns out, is my whole family, once you sort out who actually showed up